esports almost worked as a business back then. You weren't just taking millions in investment, paying an insane salary to someone, and then just going, well, I haven't got anything left, so can I have some more money? Like, that wasn't really the thing back then. It was almost more like you had your budget from the sponsors, then you had these players, depending on how good they are, how good your org is, you do negotiations. It had a logic to it. So I would say it actually felt like more like a real business and a real media space back then, not kind of, sometimes now it does feel like some sort of weird, almost like con game to trick outsiding people to put these millions in, and then we pretend like, question mark, question mark, question mark, profit. Then we're all millionaires. And it's the NFL. It's like, well, there's a lot of steps there that we haven't done. It's like, shh, what are you talking about? You're going to mess this whole thing up for us all. We're all massive salaries.
Hey, SE Historian here. And today we have a piece that really exits the realm of my typical coverage. Being the SE Historian, it goes without saying that my primary focus is, and always will be, telling the stories that StarCraft and RTS at large have to offer. And while today's guest Thorin certainly left his mark on StarCraft, he's largely moved on from it, focusing his attention on titles like Counter-Strike and League of Legends. Duncan and I had a conversation covering so much from his career, his experience with StarCraft, his vision for and gripes with esports, and much, much more. If you're excited about this one, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss out on part 2 of this piece. If you really enjoy what I do, consider supporting me on Patreon. Your support really helps. And now, without further ado, here's my word with Thorin.
Okay, so Thorin, thank you so much for taking the time today, man. I really appreciate it.
All right.
So I've got a whole bunch of stuff for you prepared today. Obviously, this is a little different than my typical thing. I tend to historically interact with folks who are either, kind of just in the StarCraft community or just in the RTS community. But I think it's really fascinating to sort of hear about some of this RTS related stuff from the perspective of somebody who has a much broader view, not, just through RTS, but also I'm personally interested in a lot of stuff that's outside of the RTS community. So, I'm looking to branch out a bit. So, starting off, where'd you grow up?
I grew up in the northeast of England. It's near, like, the trouble is, it's actually the least famous part of the UK. Like, there's two ways I can explain it. One is, if you know football, like, there's a Premier League team called Newcastle. I'm not too far from there. If you don't know football, basically, if you know Game of Thrones, the character called the Onion Knight, who's with Stannis Baratheon, if you know his accent, he's actually from, like, the sort of area I'm from. He has a similar accent, basically. Because one thing, if people don't know what Game of Thrones is, because the actual, like, Westeros is based off, like, England and the United Kingdom, basically, they also actually cleverly made a lot of the actors have an accent relative to where their character was supposed to be from in Game of Thrones. That's quite an interesting detail people don't know.
Yeah, that actually is very interesting. I'm a huge a Song of Ice and Fire fan when it comes to the books, and the television show was quite good too. But one interesting thing that a lot of people sort of like debate about is like sizing, right? Like if Westeros was actually the size of the UK, like the numbers in the books wouldn't make any sense.
Oh, sure.
Which is like so funny because like you have these armies where they say like 60,000 people or whatever, and it's
yes.
Otherwise it wouldn't be possible.
Yes.
But yeah, I didn't know that about the lining up of the accents with the geographical locations. That's good. That's pretty interesting. So do you feel like the environment you grew up in impacted you a lot? Like, do you feel like it's a big part of like kind of shaping the type of person you became?
I mean, I get the sense just from life experience, it impacts everyone. Obviously, the question is just in what regard. So I would say, for example, one of the areas I've noticed, if you are British in any context, that when you go into the wider world, that often is initially surprising to people, is they have a vision of essentially, like, I would say it's of someone probably from like 150 years ago from the upper class being like very polite and manner and formal. Whereas the joke is my area is nothing like that. My area is all the poor people. It's like the area where essentially there are almost no aristocracy. And there's probably like a few people own the land, but aside from that, it's just plebs like me. So what I would say is it's quite a rough upbringing, I would say. Like, for example, I told this story before on shows like By the Numbers I did with Richard Lewis, because we often tell like anecdotes from our lives. Like where I lived, you couldn't like go and return a video cassette that you'd rented. Like if you were like a 10-year-old kid and you did that, I mean, you could try, but you probably get your ass kicked on the way. Like, because you have to go through someone else's area to go there. And it's like hoods, if you go through the other person's area, you're not from their hood. Someone's going to notice. Even if you go in there initially, you might get in the start of the street, but some kid's going to come around on a bike, or someone's going to hear something, or a group of kids are going to come along. And so I would just say it sort of trained me in life that like people will be abrasive to you. People will sometimes try and take what's yours or knock you on the head. And so I think if people see the the way I am on the internet. Some of that's clearly impacted me in some ways. I often tell people that, like, to be fair, some of the way I am on the internet is because, life experiences I had when I was younger, and people didn't take any guff, and they were actually pretty harsh with me. It was kind of a dog-eat-dog world. So I certainly think some of that's had a knock-on effect, even though I will say in comparison to that, the esports world's not really that big a deal, as it's a lot of actors in that regard. It just seems tough and harsh.
Yeah, it's more of like on the conceptual or political level as opposed to like physical, which obviously in that scenario. Yeah. Is it still like that in terms of like like a lot of violent crime, or has it calmed down a bit?
I would say the thing is, though, I don't know what other places are like, but I would say the interesting detail is it's more like I say, it's more about like knowing the areas you go to. Like that stuff is very much clustered. So I would say it is still quite like that. Like as far as I know, it's one of the places that has the most unemployment in the country. There was even some stat, put it this way, I don't know at the moment, but it'll tell a lot to this question. Like when I was growing up, the famous line people used to say was that it was actually the place in Europe that had the most heroin users. So you can imagine it wasn't really a great scenario in that case. So look, here's the thing. It wasn't like I'm not making out like I grew up in a war zone and every day someone had like an AK against my head or something. Like, it wasn't that bad. But the point is, like, it certainly, I didn't have this vision that I think some people in esports do if they came from, let's say, like a nice middle class family in somewhere in America where they weren't near any kind of crime, whatever. They might have a very different perception of the world than me, put it that way.
Yeah, sure. No, that absolutely, that makes sense.
I mean, I'll tell you one thing it definitely had a knock-on effect with this. It's one of the reasons why, if you ever notice, I'm not someone who takes it lightly when people, because, part of, like, actually, it's kind of a bizarre dichotomy, but often poor people will flex the idea that if you have money, like, money's everything and stuff. But what's bizarre is, part of that is the idea that you don't care about money. You will just throw it away on nothing. You'll just buy a big chain, or you'll throw it on some stripper or whatever. What I'll say is, you might notice in esports, I get mad if people get ripped off even over $5,000, or if someone, like, doesn't pay $1,000 they owe. And people might be like, what's the big deal? Who cares? Like, no, where I grew up, that $5,000 might be like a quarter of your year's salary. You might have to work like 40, 50, 60 hours a week for that. So one thing people might notice is I've never gotten out of that part of the mindset. I know what my family used to make, what they used to have to work to do that and kill themselves doing a job. So that's one area I think it definitely impacted me. Because even though actually myself, I've sort of been able to escape that, part of me always does know, like, hey, money's worth a lot more to the common person than people who live in a world where it can come and go might be aware of. So you might notice that's one of my bugbears in esports. I hate anyone who steals money or lies in that sort of a regard. I sort of have that ethic still.
No, yeah, I think it definitely gives you a different perspective. Like the value of a dollar, I feel like, is the anecdotal term people use. And yeah, I think when you grow up with that sense of scarcity, it sticks with you. You keep a bit of a scarcity mindset, and you know how important that sort of stuff is. So, then getting interested in gaming, how did that come about? What got you into gaming in general in the beginning?
Well, the funny thing is, I know people try to use this as an angle to actually sell like parents on now as to why you should let your kid do games. And the problem with it is, even though it sounds like a great angle, it's actually got a bit of a sinister thing if you spin it this way, which is, I think the reason why I was into games and stuff like that is, one, we didn't have much money. So back then, like, actually, if you used old computer software, that was quite cheap actually, because obviously, like, think about it, right? If you have essentially the equipment, like, it wasn't consoles, like, we didn't have money for that, but like, I'm talking about little home computers like a Spectrum or a Commodore, these ones back in the day that used the cassette player, etc. Yeah. Well, the good thing about that was that's actually from like the generation or 10 years before me. So hence why I say, if you're poor, what you actually do, similar with clothes, is you get the hand-me-downs, don't you? You usually go and buy second-hand an old computer like that, and then you've got something to do. What I'll say is, the angle that people try to sell people on now is, it's better that your kid's like playing a video game than out in the streets, doing whatever. Who knows what they're up to, right? Yeah. Now, I will say that became a bit more sinister in the modern day when everyone's like terminally online. Like, maybe we do need to not be on the computer all the time, but back then that was actually a pretty good reason. Like, yeah, if you think about it, right, as much as your parents might not want you to be stuck in front of the PC or the computer, it still is better than getting into fights or being out all night or being where they don't know where you are. So I think part of it was just that, like, it was one of those hobbies that if you do, people will only bother you a bit. Like, obviously someone might bother you, like, do your homework or don't spend all your time on the computer or whatever. But at the same time, you are being quiet and you are sort of just doing your own thing. So I would just say early on, I was one of those people where I actually think I still have this in gaming. It's not really like the fun of playing the game that interested me. It's more like how creative someone can be with the game. Like, people can do like such imaginative things. Like just the premise of the games, I think, was the most impressive thing to me. Like, even simple games, if people know, like classic games like Arkanoid, the one where you just like, it's like one where you got a little bat and you hit a ball into a bunch of blocks and they explode, etc. Like, it's a classic style of arcade game. even that's quite inventive. If people don't know what they would do in that game, is they'd have all different power-ups and bonuses and stuff and different modes that would have. So I've always found like the idea of it's like there's more than you can think of in the game is what's interesting to me. Like the vision, the how far you can be creative. I think is what I was always drawn to in games. So I think that remains in games to this day, whether the graphics are good, whether the game style is good, whatever. But you need that core of creativity, I think.
Yeah, I think that comes from a lot of times also growing up reading to a certain extent as well, having a bit of an imaginative view as opposed to only taking what's in front of you there. So what were some of those early titles that really captivated you?
Well, it was mainly, like I say, it was actually very simple game styles. Like a lot of them back then were things like either like simple platformers. I remember there was the classic one on, I think, the Spectrum called like Monty. It was a series about someone called Monty, which is actually quite funny because I work with someone called Monte Cristo, but that's just obviously one of those coincidences in life. But it was just like a weird little platform type games, a whole bunch of those. Like I say, I actually was a big fan of stuff like Arkanoid. I don't actually know if Tetris, it was that sort of game. I actually like the games where I either want it to be like fantastical, so like I say, have a story and something cool, or I like it's just like the gameplay's got like a simple hook. It's why in a way, even though I don't play them, I can actually see why people in the modern day who don't think they're gamers do get addicted to those phone games. That's what all those phone games are. It's just you get your little hook that gets you into it. And then when you watch it as an outsider, you're always thinking like, why did they play like, like Bejeweled or something? It's just the same game a million times up. But then the joke is we all boot in and play like StarCraft 2 and do a six pool or CS and do a Rush B or like the joke is we're all doing our own version of it in a way. We all got the little hook that in our brain that we're scratching the itch with,
Yeah, some little mechanic that's just very satisfying to execute. Yeah, no, totally. So how'd you first get really involved with esports more specifically?
Well, the funny thing is, I actually always tell this. I think I actually have the coolest like initial vision on esports, but the problem is, it's only I had this vision apparently, and everyone else wasn't going along with this. And I just had to find out later, like what I hoped it didn't come to be. Which is, here's the way I'll explain it. If anyone's seen the classic '90s movie, which is definitely a guilty pleasure, it's not a great movie, but it's a guilty pleasure. The movie Hackers, the one that has like Johnny Lee Miller and Angelina Jolie in. It's actually like a pretty cool movie, but like I say, it is a guilty pleasure because you can imagine when they're doing the hacking and stuff, like they have to put really ridiculous over the top graphics on the screen. And also this is the key part that I'm getting to though. They try to also, the part that's a bit over the top is they don't just make it that these guys are losers just hacking in the bedroom. They try to make it as though it's like almost like hacking was like a punk type subculture, if you remember in the film. And like they even had their own like nightclubs. The joke is, by the way, you can even see like how it's influenced things like probably like the Matrix of that nightclub scene and stuff. So it had all these elements in where it was trying to make it seem like cool and suave to be a hacker. So it's not that was, I mean, I was actually interested in the world of computer programming and stuff like that, again, is a way to express creativity. But what I'm getting to is in the early days of esports, what were to become esports, it was just things like local LANs and qualifiers for tournaments like Quake and Counter-Strike that would then lead into bigger competitions. And what's funny is back then, that was actually part of the appeal for me. It wasn't just that this was like a hardcore game you played online, but actually back then, a lot of people might not know this, there wasn't really like fans, like there wasn't anything to watch. There wasn't even YouTube. There wasn't a streaming service. Like to watch even the match, you had to download the demo into the actual program, like a replay, and then replay the file through the actual thing. So essentially, the spectator side of it was very, very small. So I'd say back then, almost everyone who was into esports basically was some sort of competitive player. It meant you liked to play Quake 1v1, or you liked to play StarCraft, Brood War, or Warcraft, or whatever. It usually meant you were a player, and then either because you want to know what the best tactics are, or you want to see how good can someone be, you then like sort of tweaks your curiosity, you then check out a replay of the best player or the demo, etc. So what I would say is in the early days, even though I quite liked games like Quake and Doom and all the shooters, etc., I just liked them because they were fun. I think the thing that really hooked me wasn't even the idea that like I could be a top pro. It was the idea that like, wait a minute, so there are people though, and they're not just top pros, they're not just going to this one tournament because they're like, I'm good this year. They're almost trying in their own little niche circle, like how you hear about things like skateboarding took off. They start in like a little subculture, then you get a little bit of money and some sponsors. I was like, this is like that, dude. And I was getting the vibe, like, hackers. Oh my god, is this going to be like its own subculture of like super, almost like digital samurais, like people who are just like dedicated to be the best in Quake. Now, as you can see, I've already the joke is I've almost made my version of like hackers as esports to be way cooler. But the actual reality, as you can imagine, is just a bunch of nerds. It's like this guy plays in this tournament or whatever. So it wasn't really like what I imagined, but you can see it's always the idea that hooks me. I think it's not the reality can sometimes be a bit more mundane. So I actually just found the idea of like an actual circuit really exciting. It's one thing I've always tried to explain to media people when they ask this, is I get the vibe, quite frankly, they still to this day think esports is like that movie from the 80s, The Wiz, the one that was the Nintendo one where they were playing Mario Brothers. And you remember the premise was it was like Nintendo do like a world sort of search and everyone could qualify from all over the world. And then finally you're going to find out who is the best Mario player. I think that's what modern journalists think esports is. I think they actually don't understand. It's like the tennis circuit or golf or something like, or the Premier League. It's not really like everyone tries and qualifies, mate. At the end, suddenly they're in the major and, oh, God, I've won BlizzCon. It's like, mate, the guy who wins BlizzCon has definitely been a pro for like the last 10 years, has been in every big tournament. Like, it's not really an amateur like that. So I always think, actually, even the idea in the modern day of esports is kind of a bit like a caricature. Like, for me, I actually think it is more like Formula One or something where you've got this little enclave of people that you know. And I actually think that's the coolest part. I mean, you can even argue that's where the narrative elements that aren't tied directly to the game come from, of the storylines of the rivalries and who hasn't won yet or who was a champion in the past. So I think all that stuff, if you notice, it's essentially what I still do to this day in my work, no matter what game I'm in. That's always been the appeal to me. It's like, it's the idea not just of narratives, but the idea that it's like this, it's like a cast on a TV show. You've got a limited cast, but then you're going to see these characters interact in different ways. I think it's very compelling in its own way. And then the idea is, in this particular case, instead of just some story writer tell us what happens next, sort of the game gets to tell us what happens next. Does that person who was like a legendary Kong, do they ever get to win the championship? Does the person who was the old legend who comes back, does his comeback work? Does the up-and-comer actually make good, or does he fall on his first try on stage? I think those are the stories that are kind of compelling. So that stuff, even from the really early days where that stuff kind of wasn't being told, it was just people playing in a server, I think that's part of the appeal. Was like, I sort of realised, like, mate, if I'm into that, I should probably tell that story. Like, I should try and find out what this guy's vibe is and why he's competing. So yeah, I would say some of that's what drew me in.
Yeah, it makes me think back to like the early days of Brood War when they had them wearing those like ridiculous costumes.
Oh,
and
sure.
Like even they weren't quite like even the people that were very close to it couldn't quite figure out what it was and what it was supposed to be. They had smoke machines and astronaut costumes or whatever the heck they were wearing. Yeah, so it took a little bit of time for people to get their bearing on what actually made sense and what didn't look too silly. I think you kind of answered this already, but like, so your drive to take a more journalistic approach on your engagement with esports, it sounds like, was fueled by your desire to sort of tell those stories of individual development and the way that the players interact with each other. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I actually think this is the part that people have missed the entire trick in esports. Like, the obvious example in the modern day, there's actually a great like cultural example I can give now, I think people will get, which is there's a lot of people I know that had no interest in any form of motorsport. Some of them Americans who didn't even know Formula One, who just because of that Drive to Survive reality series they do on Netflix, they're sort of like either a fan of that show or even now a fan of Formula One because of that show. And now I will say the reason why actually it's probably the best example is I don't even think that show is actually as well done as people think, because if you actually know the sport, they do like all reality series sort of like sex up certain storylines that aren't really there because they have to like push a rivalry, or they will do things like selectively edit a clip so it seems like the guy was saying something more spicy about his rival than he actually was. But the point I'm getting to is what that suggests to me is the actual human interest element of, like I say, archetypal stories people understand of like, right, you're the great player who was supposed to be the best, but you've never won yet. You always finish second. Will you ever win? Or, wow, this was a legendary guy who 3 years ago was the best, but he's still going now. Can he beat the, up and comers, etc.? These stories aren't really about the sport Formula One. Like, that could be a story about StarCraft. That could be the story of like Boxer coming back in StarCraft 2, or it could be like Sue never winning the GSL or something. Like, those stories, actually the most compelling part about the story is the part around the game. Like, the way Sue played Zerg isn't actually as cool a story as like, how was he so good every day except the GSL finals? Why did he always like seem cursed? Everyone can understand the concept of like a cursed figure, or why was he so unlucky? Or, wow, I know what it's like to feel like you're best and then you just fail in front of everyone. Those aspects actually will make someone the other way around want to know why in the game he's doing this or why he's that good. So I actually think that's the element of esports they've failed to sell. They've tried to sell it as a sport, which is the idea of just watch the thing and you'll enjoy it, or they've tried to sell it as like like I say, some sort of youth thing of like, oh, it's the new thing. Wow, it's novelty. It's cool. No, the way you sell it's on the human angle. Like I've always told people, I'll give you a quick analogy. I had a lot of people over the years, as you can imagine, from different degrees and scales of publisher say to me, would you be interested in writing a book about esports? But they're all thinking I'm going to write, the big book of esports. It's like it's sort of encyclopedia, but they don't realize that wouldn't be interesting. No one would buy that. Even if someone in esports bought it, you put it on your coffee table. Like the joke is I wouldn't open that book because who would? It sounds boring, doesn't it? It sounds like an all right concept because you think, well, there's got to be one, but it doesn't actually sound that good. So what I always told them as my pitch actually was like this. I told them, forget all that. You don't want to do that. What you want is this book. You want a book that just tells the cool narrative stories of the greatest players. So my idea, I even told them, anyone who wants it, man, can have this. If you want to go do it, do it. My idea was the book would be called The Heroes and Villains of Esports. And then it would be people like brilliant players like, I don't know, Rafa and Quake, who overcame all these amazing things to be a champion in a game that, by the way, started about 10 years too late. I'd even do for the villains. I'd do people like Savior, where the cool angle is. I've even thought this is how people fail to tell narratives. Here's how you tell the story of Savior. It's actually genius because if this was a movie, this is the artistic license you'd take. It's not just that he was a brilliant StarCraft player on one hand, but then on the other hand, totally unconnected. He was some weird guy who was doing match fixing or potentially doing some like shit. No, the two were obviously connected. Like to me, if you know the way Savior played in Brood War, he was like a mastermind technician that you could sort of never outmaneuver. Well, then essentially, I imagine that sort of a person might think they could get away with crime or always be ahead of someone, or might even think to themselves, I can win the game whenever I want. Maybe I'll mess around and make some money in other ways. Like, actually, that seems exactly what like an anime-esque villain would do, isn't it? So I think if you actually told these stories, right, I think these stories would be mega compelling. I mean, as I even alluded to there's another angle, by the way. Even though people have done the odd like visual novel aware, why is there not like actual animators of these kind of storylines? I feel like if you ever watch those like tennis and soccer ones they do in Japan, this would be like amazing grist for this sort of a story because we all know the characters are there already. If you have people like Naniwa or like I say these legendary figures from any other game, that's almost like perfect casting. Like I actually think the mainstream people, the other mistake they're making is they don't know esports, so they do think it's just a bunch of boring nerds. They don't know that, like I say, if you get someone like Nanawa, mate, the joke there is like you could have like a whole series just on him. Like think of all the crazy stuff he was up to and all the beefs he was involved with. Like, well, if you're in, I'm not really a fighting game guy, but that Leffen guy seems like he's just box office as well. He's not just a good player, he has all these amazing dramas and rivalries and statements to make. So yeah, I actually think that aspect is totally misunderstood. If you notice, it's basically my thing. I try on some level in some games to get some sort of strategic or tactical, analytical understanding, but my base is always that. It's like, what's the story? And if you notice, like I said, I don't try like an outsider to sort of impose a story on. Like I'm going to make you the villain and you're the good. No. The great thing about the game, they're there already. Like the joke is, of course, there's some like super lovely guy that everyone loves in StarCraft. And of course, there's some. They're already there. You just have to tell that story. It's actually you have to extract it from them instead of trying to sort of implant it into it artificially, in my opinion.
Yeah, these are the stories that like transcend the actual game itself. And I think that's what people don't necessarily realize is that like, there is this like, there are these rags to riches or fall from grace stories that just transpire naturally. And some of them are more dramatic, like, save your life, match fixing. And some of them are a bit more mundane about, somebody's gameplay just falling off. There's all kinds of metatextual things to look at there, and absolutely like you could know nothing about the game, but you're going to find it inherently interesting that like somebody was at the top of the world and they threw away their career for like these sort of bad reasons. And what are the reasons and so on. Absolutely. So, you've dipped your toes or gotten very, deeply involved in a lot of major esports titles, and have like a pretty well fleshed out knowledge of a lot of different communities. How do you stay on top of sort of these ever shifting, scenes?
I will say I actually do feel in some weird way like I am almost like esports is my calling that I was supposed to do. And it's almost like when I look at like my skill set and I look at the world that esports exists in this like digital domain, it's almost like I am the sort of person who should just do this job. Because I have to say, even though I know a lot of people say that they think there's like information overload in the modern day, you've all got all these feeds coming at you on Twitter and Instagram and all these different, and then there's unlimited news and media. And so I don't find that kind of like overwhelming personally. I don't really get burned out in that way. For me, it's more like, and the analogy would be, I kind of view it like it's like you're surfing on a wave. You just kind of like, you're not going to take it all in. You just try and take the stuff that's relevant. So what I'm getting to here is I actually think a key secret is I actually do the opposite to most people. Instead of trying to go piece by piece, I actually try to sort of bombard myself with as much info, history, matches as I can. And then I trust that over the years, I've sort of built up some kind of an intuitive system or protocols where I will then be able to pass that information. So actually, an example I often give is if it's a game where I'm not someone who grew up in that game, like StarCraft's a good example. I played StarCraft, like the single player one. Then I started watching the Koreans just for Brood War. I was never a guy who was super into Warcraft 3 or StarCraft because I was from FPS games. I was a Quake and a Counter-Strike player, etc. So for games like that, since I know that my grounding isn't in the game and I wasn't there when all that stuff was happening, there are actually ways you can sort of do that artificially. Like an example is you do read what I would do is I would watch like a classic StarCraft final, and then I would go on to something like Team Liquid or Reddit, depending on what year we're talking about here, and I would do things like I would look at the actual match thread of people who'd watched that game live, and I'd try and see so this was actually a big upset. They didn't mention it on the broadcast, but actually this guy wasn't supposed to win. They all thought like TVZ, like the Terran was going to win this match, but wow, it was an upset, and then and the build he was doing was that, and basically, you have to figure out, obviously, who's talking nonsense and which comments to dismiss. That's why I say it's not just, you don't just read it, you have to pass it. But over time, you sort of get a sense, especially when you've done a lot of these games, of who seems like they actually know what they're talking about. And obviously, you take a piece of info and then you apply it yourself. Next time you watch a game, you try and think what they make sense. And what I'll say is, essentially, the community, if you actually know how to listen and crucially who not to listen to, can actually sort of tell you most of the stuff about the game because they're all there as well. They're all living this game. They're all watching it. So it is the case that if it's a game like Counter-Strike, the joke goes, sometimes I would have people who were brand new broadcast talents would come to an event I was working and they'd go, where are all your notes? I thought you'd do all research. I was like, what? You might need notes, mate. I live this game. Like I've watched every single match this team's ever played and I was at every other tournament. So like in those games, I don't have to like research all the time. If I'm in a game that isn't mine though, like StarCraft or League of Legends, I will always give it like the due diligence of like, I will actually go and I will treat it like I'm a historian. I'll sometimes treat it like it's all in the past. I'm just digging it up and looking for sources and contrasting. So I do think if you're going to a game that isn't like a natural fit or you just weren't there for a long time, I do think you have to sort of like show the respect and actually do, like I say, your due diligence. You actually have to sort of immerse yourself in it. And then, like I say, you don't have to yourself always be the expert. Just find other experts and listen to what they're saying and see if what they make sense to you. Crucially, that's the other thing. You don't just take what they say at face value no matter who they are. It has to make sense to you. It has to, go through your process. Okay, that I've vetted to me. I understand what he means. And then you use that to inform yourself. So I think that's actually a big detail because, yeah, there's definitely esports games I've been involved with where that's not my game at all. If it wasn't a big esport, maybe I never, like League of Legends, I probably never would have touched it ever, mate.
Yeah, I've never actually verbalized this, but it's funny because I'm hearing what you're saying, and I'm like, oh, I actually do the same thing, especially when it comes to Brood War stuff. Like, I can think precisely of just like reading through these old TL threads, because I don't have a particularly deep understanding of Brood War. I came in way later than that, so yeah, it really does help you contextualize it. So yeah, that's good to know. It gives you it gives me a much clearer picture as to how you do what you do, because it does seem a little crazy to me. Like if somebody asked me questions about deep questions about the CS or the LOL community, I couldn't actually engage in a really real way without doing some kind of due diligence like that. So that makes sense. So what got you interested in something like Korean Brood War, which at the time was pretty obscure?
Well, the funny thing is, this is why actually the order of the questions in the interview is going to be quite good, because that basically is the closest thing to that imagined hacker subculture I was dreaming of before. Like I said, the actual saddest thing about esports to me is that people make it this like giant world-spanning tournament circuit. I actually think the reason why like Korean Brood War and later on StarCraft 2 and League of Legends have been so compelling, specifically when it's just in Korea, is because essentially it's almost like the ultimate version of esports, because everyone is living in the same cities. There's no big travel, jet, like none of that. Everyone already lives in that country. So again, no external factors are affecting it. It's basically like, and everyone's going 12 to 14 hours. You're all like pushing each other, and then you're all on pro teams. You're like, essentially it's almost like, except you'd scale the money and other factors up, it's almost like the best you could hope for in esports. And I actually think if you look at those circuits, as a result, it makes them the best narratively and the best in terms of style of play. Like there's a reason why, sorry to all the Serral fans out there, there's a reason why it doesn't matter how many tournaments he wins with the Codes players there, it will never be the same as being in Korea for a whole month and winning Codes. That will always be something different, because everyone knows, if you follow StarCraft, that is kind of the ultimate level. Like there's a reason why some people have never won Codes, but they've won everything else. And some people people who've won the Codesses are the ones that are revered. That's not to say you're not as good, but that is the place that's the highest, that's the gold standard of StarCraft esports, and I would say any esport that had Koreans involved, quite frankly. So one thing I love about that is then when you have a circuit like that that's like self-contained, the best thing is, like I said before, you're automatically going to generate the soap opera, the narratives, because like I say, you're going to have like Sue's going to make like 5 finals and then not win. Then you're going to have some rival of his, like SOS or whatever, that wins the odd one, but he's just unbelievable when he wins. You're going to have these cool narratives just come out of it. And the best thing is, it's actually like sports. It's like Formula One or like a league that people run. It's the same people playing. It's not like where you have like, there's 32 players, but like I know 8 of them, there's 5 people out there. Like the best thing about these circuits, because they're so self-contained, is it is almost like seasons of a show. Like you want to know, oh, this guy's, he's down in Korea now, he's having a bad split, but he might come back later. Like, you can follow those stories up and down. It's not just who's at the biggest tournament. So I actually think Koreans, they sort of nailed it. I know part of it's because they did it sort of in a TV manner, that they've done some of the other things over there, but whatever angle they got on it, I think they've got the best one. So to me, that was the one that actually taught me I could even be interested in games I didn't think I had any appeal towards, because I was doing things like Counter-Strike and Quake, but these were all games, like I say, I grew up in these games. I was playing, like the joke is I play these games for fun on the side anyway, even if I hadn't have done esports. But like I say, I wasn't a big StarCraft multiplayer fan. It was never really my style. And so what actually got me hooked on it was, I remember finding like, I think it was like Liquipedia or something, and just seeing like, those pages. I remember specifically, it was the pages for the tournaments like the OSL or the MSL. And I remember seeing, and they would have those little things where it had who won the badges, how many times they'd won. It's like, wait a minute, so only like 3 people have won it 3 times. Yeah. And then like 10 people. That was dope. I remember being like, this is fucking sick. Even this overlay should be like on every single site. Like in Counter-Strike, why don't we have a list of all the people who won the majors and, you know, how many were the most and who got the most silver medals? Like that aspect I could immediately see. Like, hey, I'm just narratively interested. Why did this guy win 3, but then this guy only won 1 gold and then 3 silvers if it was like yellow or something like that, you know? Like there would be these people where immediately the question becomes like, I don't know about the game, but I almost should know so I can answer this question. So I gotta say, I actually think in terms of the type of circuit I think it's the best example. It's the Korean one.
Yeah, it's what you said is really hits the nail on the head in terms of it being like a cast on a television show, because you have like this group of guys, like let's say like 60 top guys, and they all know each other really, really well. They know each other's play styles really, really well, yes. and so yeah, it's going to create this unbelievable level of competition because, you know, they're not just playing the game, they're playing each other, they're playing the scene, they're playing the team. Yeah, it's a fascinating dichotomy. So you ended up getting pretty involved then later on a more global level with StarCraft 2. You know, I'm like, when that became a really big esport, how did that come about? How'd you end up getting involved with StarCraft 2 then?
Well, this is actually where I'm lucky that I already it was only a couple of years earlier, had gotten interested in Brood War. Basically, it was actually around the era when people like Flash and Jadon were on top in Brood War, like the end of the 2000s, when I got into that. Like I say, I just initially got interested narratively. Like the joke is when I used to fire up the old VODs, I won't say the names because it'll hurt people's feelings, but I even used to watch those like Westerners where it's just a random guy like, hey, it's so-and-so Billy Bob, nobody on his YouTube channel, and I'm here to watch Bisou versus Flash. And then the joke is, like, the reason I'm saying I watched them is I knew so little about Brood War, I didn't know that half of them aren't even called the build out correctly, and they're all sort of like amateurish players. Like, so essentially, that's how you know at the time I was just interested in, like, who's going to win, you know, or even the basics they're telling me seemed like gold. Like, oh my God, wow, is that 2 racks? Is that the build, is it? Even though, like I say, if I actually look back now, I'd probably cringe if I watched some of those. Like they weren't the best commentary. But again, I was a beginner. So luckily for me, because that meant me get interested in Brood War, it meant that when StarCraft 2 came out, if people don't know, StarCraft 2 is probably the first game ever to simultaneously be like artificially sort of dubbed the new biggest game in esports, but then also sort of live up to it with the actual appeal of it. And it actually had a few years, people will know, basically before League of Legends just scaled up with player base, when it was the top dog. But as I say, part of it was artificial. I mean, people will know if you're in the Brood War scene. There was one point in time where we were almost sort of told, I mean, Koreans essentially literally were like, stop playing Brood War, you have to play StarCraft 2. And I was like, oh, okay. Which that never happened before in history. You know, you just migrate when you do, when you stay in the old game if you don't. So when StarCraft 2 came along, I quickly saw that, like, even before League, the scale that StarCraft 2 was taking, like, media to and esports, like interest around interviews at events, even some of these other aspects, it was already going to a high level. People knew the viewership was going way, way up. Being a commentator was a much bigger deal. At the time that StarCraft 2 came out, what you would have as a commentator in Counter-Strike was essentially like two people who were never pros, and they were both just play-by-play, and they were just essentially telling you what happened on the screen, and then like the most light level of analysis ever, like, you know, wow, they're 4 rounds behind, they better get it together, but no actual like game analysis. So I remember thinking like, wow, this is on like a way bigger level than any of the other esports before. So I knew at the time as a journalist, like it'd be kind of silly. This is the key detail that actually, now I think about it, I guess the modern day journalist doesn't get the chance to. Because back then, almost every event was a multi-game event. Like if I go to an Intel Extreme Masters, it's going to have, Counter-Strike and Quake, the games I'm doing, but it's going to have StarCraft as well, then later League of Legends or some other World of Tanks or something. If I go to DreamHack, it's going to have Quake there, and it's going to have Dota there, and so the cool thing was, because these were multi-games, well, at the time I was going as a journalist, I was just going to do post-game interviews and, you know, like maybe I would say like career interviews, but it's nothing like I do now. It'd be more like, you know, just a sit-down interview for an hour, which at the time seemed mind-blowing to do an hour-long interview. So I would go and do those things, and I remember just thinking, well, if this is the biggest game in the world, and it's essentially one with the biggest media interest, I'd be kind of a fool not to dip my toe into the pool, wouldn't I? Shouldn't I try and do a few? So what I would do, you can even go back and check this is, if you go and look at my early StarCraft interviews, it's often people who played Brood Wars or Warcraft, or I can look them up on a wiki, or I even knew them, or it's someone like, you know, like the joke is, if people don't know, most of the StarCraft players came from those old games. That was what their basis was in. So I thought, well, that's already sort of an in there, isn't it? Like I know who Grubby is from Warcraft. I could do an interview with him already, basically. I already know who this guy from StarCraft Brood War was, who was in the Western scene or North America or something. So I tried to use, like, you know, what areas do I have strength? I don't know the game that much in the scene, but I know some of the players. And then that was the game, like I say, that made me realize, if you like other aspects of the scene, you don't have to necessarily like the game itself that much. I mean, if you ever notice, my interviews were never like, right, so Rotterdam, why did you build the Zealots at this point? I was never doing that sort of an interview. Mine would always be, if you notice, that's my style. It's about the narrative. So it would be more like, hey, I thought you were supposed to be the favourite to win this game, and hadn't you beaten him 3 times before? What happened this time? If you notice, I'm actually asking for his experience on that there. So one thing I've always done, I will say it with some of my content when I'm being a bit spicy. Obviously, I might be joking. In general, I do try to just stick to what I know. I try to look at what I understand and what I know, and I work from that. And if I can expand it out, I can get more complicated. But it's why when I come into these games, I'd say I always start pretty humble. I just start out. I even often tell people, if people don't know, like in this case, in StarCraft or League, in the early days, for probably the first 2 years, from every interview, I would usually say before I turn the camera on, by the way, I'm not like a massive StarCraft 2 guy. Like, if I don't know something, let me know. If you think I got something correct, just correct me. Don't worry about that. Essentially, you're going to help me. I'm just here to help you get the answers out, Anna. So that's actually one final thing I'd add as well, is I think people make this mistake, which is, because the kind of vocal person who replies on the internet or posts a comment about something on the internet will usually be someone who has a complaint or some sort of critique, right? So often the critique will be something like, you don't know what you're talking about, or you didn't ask this thing here. I think it actually gets in the head of a lot of content creators, and they stupidly think they're supposed to be like an expert. Like, they act like, to be in StarCraft interview, you have to be art horses. It's like, no, the joke is you can interview art horses. Like, he's got all the info. Your job actually is just to kind of like get out of his way and then help him when he wants to answer, and help him say what you know he's trying to say. So I would actually say that aspect too, which is, I also had a long history doing interviews and doing event work. So I also thought to myself, I could just send this guy who's just our StarCraft 2 guy, but he's only going to be able to do the interviews with the people he knows. I could do the other interviews. I have the skill set of an interviewer. So I also tried, in that sense, like I said, to not have too much opinion. I tried to just help the other person express themselves. I think actually that has value in all types of interviews.
So you mentioned some of those early disputes between like the StarCraft 1 and StarCraft 2 communities, and even some of that coming from the top down. What do you know about the Kespa dispute with Blizzard in those early days?
Right, I will say, obviously, I'm not a legal expert or a lawyer, so I'm speaking purely on things I read on the internet, / a little bit of speculation and behind the scenes sort of industry talk. But I actually think, as far as I know, that has actually been completely misrepresented. There's like a key cultural aspect to that story that a lot of people don't understand. The Westerners, or people only reading Team Liquid, think the story goes like this. So what happened was, they think that Blizzard came into Korea, where they already had this totally self-sustaining Brood War industry, where they had TV channels and everything. You have Kespa running it all. You have all the teams. They're all integrated into this crazy hierarchy. And essentially, Blizzard came in, and because they're Westerners and they're Americans, they were like, hey, man, this is our copyright, man. You can't just like use my game and that shit, man. Like, and what they didn't realize is, you're not in America right now, mate. Like, I know this might be like a blow to you, but you're not actually like in an American empire where you're like Cersei in like fucking 300 and you're like the god emperor. Like, what you have have to do in all scenarios, and they've learned this with China, is you have to hope the local authorities agree with you. Otherwise, your IP rights mean nothing, mate. So they came in, and if this was America, by the way, this would be an open shut case. Of course, what you'd be told is they do own the IP right to this game. Of course, you can't like distribute it or do tournaments without their permission. It's contained within the TOS and all the rest of it. And it would just be, like I said, it'd be an open shut case in America. What people don't know about that case is, as far as I know, it was almost, I'm not even sure if you actually read the way it was written, that it was necessarily that like the Koreans lost this case entirely. As far as I can tell, it was something along the lines of like, I remember there was even some sort of like characterization in the case that was almost like people were telling the Blizzard people, like, this is Korea though, and you're talking about a Korean company that's done all the, because essentially the argument, if people don't know, is a bigger point about IP rights. The question is, do people really watch GSL Code S because Mike Morhaime and Blizzard made an awesome RTS game, or do they actually watch, and obviously I'm going to be biased because I agree with this, or do they actually watch because Maru's really good at playing Terran? Like, I would suggest if Maru isn't there, less people watch than just the fact Terran is good at race in StarCraft 2. So essentially it was it's quite an interesting philosophical debate, you'll notice. Essentially it's what does the performer bring to the game, as well as how essential is the game. And so to me, the Koreans were always trying to make that argument. Essentially what they were essentially saying is, look, you made the game, but we made all the rest, didn't we? We have done all the rest, and in fact we don't need you, quite frankly. And this is Korea. And if people don't know, Korea, China as well, some of these countries are much more aggressive about pursuing sort of what you'd call like I guess like it's almost like a kind of isolationism. Like they heavily promote things from their country. Like another thing people might not know is the reason why, for example, in Korea, they would play the game Crossfire, but not Counter-Strike, even though Crossfire, the joke is it's a bad version of Counter-Strike. Yeah. It's because I believe Crossfire was actually coded by Koreans. So to them, that gives it an extra value. So first of all, the characterization I think a Westerners got wrong is, as far as I know, actually this didn't go that well for Blizzard. And even though, yes, Kespa stopped doing Brood War, it didn't stop it overnight. And if you notice, it did that awkward transition where they did like a year of the both and then they just went to StarCraft 2. And as far as I can tell, that was almost more like, I think it was like they knew that like the battle would continue on and maybe it would go to a bit. So like it was almost like you just had a truce and then both parties eventually did move to StarCraft 2. So I actually think that one's probably a bit lost on people. And I also do think, even though I actually do understand that on a legal basis, especially in America, Blizzard would have all the rights, I actually do think to some degree what they did there was sort of cutting off their nose to spite their face, because in my opinion, the Korean Brood War scene, I mean, you know this from StarCraft 2, it was never as big. StarCraft 2 was never anywhere close to the size of Brood War in Korea. Look, GSL was dope, so if you're a Western, it's awesome, and there's still people who play it, but there was never the tens of thousands of people trying to be a pro like they were in Brood War, actually, right until it ended. So the problem I think a lot of people don't understand is, like, I do think that was actually a much, much bigger deal than people realize, because even though maybe Brood War would have wound down eventually, I don't know, if I see the ASL now, I feel like that game always had this like crazy grassroots sort of groundswell, you know, like the joke is to this day, I lived in Korea in like 2014 and 2015. Even in those years, if I went into a random PC bang, no one was playing StarCraft 2. There'd be like a random kid just playing on the ladder or just some like fun map on Brood War, as well as, you know, someone playing FIFA and Crossfire and League of Legends or whatever. I'd never see anyone play StarCraft 2. So I actually do think the mistake there was, even though I get it that like if someone's sort of saying like, yeah, but I don't care about your IP rights, I own your game, it's like you're going to battle them. But at the same time, I feel like actually the compromise should have probably also been on Blizzard's end, because in my opinion, you can never get that back once you've killed a scene like that. Once it's gone, it's gone. And as you say, it was a very unique scene. It was like nothing we've ever seen in the West. It was huge, but in a very, very niche way, wasn't it? So yeah, it's a complicated topic. I don't think there was anyone right or wrong in that. Like, again, it's a legal dispute partially, and I think morally it's not really even an area that we can wade into, because like a lot of those precedents are based on weird things like what did Disney do in the law 70 years ago or something weird like that, you know. So it's quite a complicated topic.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a complicated topic, and I feel like there's so many intricacies to how it played out. Like, you know, like one of the things is, StarCraft 2 did never reach those heights that Brood War did in South Korea, and you know, my contention, and I think a lot of people's contention, is that you know, Kespa was almost trying to purposely hamstring StarCraft 2 from the get-go, because they thought that perhaps StarCraft 1 would continue. For example, some people had told me that there had been purposeful misinformation put out there that StarCraft 2 was not playable in PC bongs in those early days. Like Tasteless told me this, and that actually when Mike Morhaime visited Korea, he said this to Mike Morhaime, Tasteless did, and Mike Morhaime was like, no, what the hell? Like, why do people think this? You totally can play StarCraft 2 in PC bongs. And And the same thing, like, they had this Kespa holdout, right, where all those names that were these household names in South Korea at the time, your Flash, Jaedong, Bisu, Stork, weren't able to compete in StarCraft 2, and this also really hurt the sort of cultural identity of StarCraft 2, because it was viewed as all of the people that were competing in StarCraft 2 were really like second-rate talents. They were retired pros or like low-level pros that didn't have a real career in Brood War.
I think a lot of the Westerners never got that, dude. They never understood what you're saying, which is that to the random Korean fan of esports, they just saw people even like MVP, they just saw them as like a jobber from Brood War. They actually didn't respect it. I know what you mean, yeah. Even though to us in the West, they were the gods. Yeah, at the time, the perception was, but that's just because Flash, look, the joke is Flash never did make it, but everyone just thought if Flash and Jaedong came, they'd dust these guys off tomorrow, didn't they? Yeah, of course.
Exactly. And then, but in those early days of StarCraft 2 that you were involved in, what was the culture like behind the scenes? How were people treated? What was the interaction like between working professionals like yourself and the pro gamers and the tournament organizers, things of that nature?
Well, the thing is, I would say, even though that era, like, aesthetically looks very similar to the modern era, it already looks quite professional. Like, everyone is like you say, it's not like the Brood War days when people are wearing silly outfits or it's presented as some like laughable, novelty. This is like, it's almost like sports. Like, everyone's got the jerseys on. There's loads of teams, if people remember back then. Because obviously the good thing about StarCraft is you can have one player or two players, and it's not the same as having to pay a whole team of Counter-Strike players to go around the world. So you can have a couple. And by the way, I'll even say back then, people were way more cynical. Like, if you're some guy who's like the fifth best Ukrainian Zerg player, you're not going to GSL, are you? You're just going to the tournaments in Europe until you prove yourself, and then maybe if you get really good, they'll let you go to an MLG in America once or something, So also, I will say the scale made a lot more sense. Like, back then, put it this way, esports almost worked as a business back then. You weren't just taking millions in investment, paying an insane salary to someone, and then just going, well, I haven't got anything left, so can I have some more money? Like, that wasn't really the thing back then. It was almost more like you had your budget from the sponsors, and you had these players, depending on how good they are, how good your org is, you do negotiations. It had a logic to it. So I would say it actually felt like more like a real business and a real media space back then, not kind of, sometimes now it does feel like some sort of weird, almost like con game to trick outsiding people to put these millions in, and then we pretend like, question mark, profit. Then we're all millionaires, and it's the NFL. It's like, well, there's a lot of steps there that we haven't done. It's like, shh, what are you talking about? You're going to mess this whole thing up for us all. We're all massive salaries. Like, that's the part about esports I don't like. Now, back then, there was actually a very real sense that this thing was getting bigger, but in a legit way, and that we were all riding the edge of this wave that was going to take over the whole world. And I'll say one thing that was really cool was, in the early years of StarCraft 2, I don't think I've ever seen a game that's had this, which is because, crucially, the key thing about StarCraft that a lot of people don't know is it was only in Korea that they kept playing Brood War, and then weirdos like Artosis and In Control and stuff also played it just because they were just obsessed with it, like I was, right? But it was Warcraft 3 was the game that everyone in the West played in the meantime. That was the game that took over and had all the people like Grobby and Stefano and all those guys playing that game. And what happened was, StarCraft 2 obviously united the communities, and suddenly you had all these people coming from all these games into one game. And there was actually like a gold rush vibe, I have to say, in the early years of, like, if you went to tournaments, there was so many people trying to attend as pros. There was bazillion people in every online cup. By the way, the joke back then was, because luckily in StarCraft, it's actually one of the best games to play online, where you can have some lag, but you can still be pretty good. Yeah. The joke was, if you looked at like a random online qualifier for like an IEM in Germany, there really would be in like upper round 4, there'd be like some Korean guy who'd be in like the semi-final of Korea. What the fuck? But he might lose, by the way. It's like a random German player that might never even make the tournament. So it was crazy. Essentially, it really felt like everyone's trying to play this game. Everyone's interested in this game. And I'll tell you what as well, the circuit was enormous. Like, I think people in the modern day, they might, with the cops, feel like they make up for it, but you could actually have a LAN every weekend in that game. I mean, there was a famous LAN, I remember, must have been around late November, because it was when DreamHack Winter was on. I remember there was a LAN where I attended DreamHack Winter at the same time as there was like, I think like an IEM going on in Asia, in StarCraft as well, and then like a third tournament, like America going on. So like on 3 continents on the same weekend, there was StarCraft 2 tournaments were like, and the players were all mixed up. So back then I remember thinking, like, this is like the ultimate buffet of esports, basically. You can like eat as much as you want or as little as you want. So I actually think one thing that you might notice is very different in my concept from other people is, I don't subscribe to that view that when you build the narrative, you want like scarcity in how often people meet. Like, I don't buy that thing of like, you want this guy to be the North American champion and he wins all the North American tournaments. Then this guy's like, the Korean champion, but they never meet because you need to get the tension up. But then they meet at the final of BlizzCon, and who's going to win? I actually think that's just what a movie would make as the plot. I actually think in real life, by the way, like I said earlier, I love it in the Korean scene if It's like, right, it's episode 50 of Flash versus Jill. It's like, who cares, mate? That's what makes it dope, is that they played a million times.
Yeah.
And you know that one of them was on top at one point and then the other one overcame him, and what's going to happen this time. I actually think playing many, many times is what makes the story. So I'll also say I did think it was amazing for that. Like, because people were playing so many tournaments, you could track everyone's runs and when they were good and then who was actually dominant. And also, yeah, I'll tell you what, back then with that many lands, the sample size to be the best is really huge. Like now, maybe you can chill for a month or so, or you can do the online cups, but no one will count it. As long as you get to the IEM or something like that and win it, you're still the best player. Back then, if you have 2 tournaments that are bad, there'll be some guy who's the hot new shit, basically. He'll be on top now and you're going to fight your way back. So it was also very, very competitive. Like, it actually had a very open vibe to it in that sense. It actually felt like if you were good, you would find a team, you would get in the tournaments, you have loads of chances to prove yourself. And if actually, by the end, if you are legit, even if you start as nobody, we'll know you in a year or two. So it also had like a very meritocratic feel, I would say, in that sense. Like, the one thing I would definitely contrast it heavily against is, that's one thing I think it does suck about modern esports, is they've gone so much into that franchise model that's like almost like a bad artificial version of what I was talking about, of having like a limited cast. Because in that scenario, like, you can't get into a scene unless the team decides to pick you up. In the open circuit, I could just make a team pick me up if I'm just good enough. If I just force my win, it doesn't matter what country I'm from, who I am, if I seem like a dickhead. If I'm brilliant at the game, some capitalist guy's going to go, hey, I'll put my logo on this guy, pay him the salary, get him in the squad. So I actually think the funny thing is, in the modern day, people like the aforementioned Naniwa, who's a mate of mine. The joke in the modern is he wouldn't get picked up to a team if it was in League of Legends. They just wouldn't let him be in LEC or LCK, right? But back then, he was just so good, you had to. You couldn't stop him being in the tournament, which was also kind of a bit dope. It's actually why, if you notice, I don't think we have as many spicy people in the modern day as that. Back then, some of these guys were like Wild West figures, Idra and all these sorts of guys. Like, they weren't just playing the game. They brought like a wild energy with them as well, didn't they? And they almost were sort of like anti-heroes. It was like, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you. And then they still try and win the tournament. It's mad, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's this cowboy feel. Yeah, that like I feel like doesn't exist. Things feel a bit too polished for that now, especially when you have these like major advertisers involved and things of that nature. So yeah, it becomes a bit contentious. And you mentioned like, you know, people continuing to play Brood War, and what you said is totally accurate as well. Where like even today, like the depth of field for competitive Brood War in Korea is deeper than StarCraft 2. And this is 26 years, you know, after the release of the game, which is mind blowing. It's like the only example of something like this I've ever seen in my life. But yeah, no, that absolutely makes sense. Like in terms of how the industry has developed. And another thing you touched on that really stands out to me is just, you know, so many of these organizations and being fully VC funded and just it not making sense when you see a few $1 million poured into something and then the viewership is like 30-40K. There's something doesn't line up there. And so it's very weird. And yeah, like that is something I often hear from a lot of the more industry OGs, is that initially it was like a real business. There was just like a guy putting some money in and needing to see a return. And if he didn't see a return, it just wasn't going to keep happening. And yeah, that is a bit more organic. So one of the things you touched on the end there was about this sort of unorganic development of tournaments and everything becoming so franchise. And I think that was one of the major criticisms of Blizzard's take to StarCraft 2 esports going into the 2012 season, where they standardized it and made this forgot what they called it at that time. Yeah, WCS I think came in 2013. 2012 was like BattleNet World Championship or something like that.
Oh, right. Yes.
But yeah, basically the same thing. Yeah. So yeah, like you know, what did you think on that? What was your take on that at the time, that it was becoming this very standardized thing?
Well, the funny thing is, you could actually argue it's not true. You could argue, if you look publicly, it actually looks like me giving my opinion on that exact topic at the time you're talking about in like 2012 is why I don't work in StarCraft 2 anymore. It's not actually true, but it would look like that from the outside, because what happened was, back in the day, we did an episode of Chan Man's Unfiltered, and he wanted to do one where I already had some beef at the time with Destiny, right? So I said, well, I don't want to come on if Destiny's on, because, spoiler, it didn't work out great last time. So he said, right, what I'll do is I'll make a new show. It'll be, instead of being Unfiltered, it's Unfiltered Esports. And I think he only did one episode as the joke, because he just made it as this one-off custom thing to do with me and Richard. And what happened was, me and Richard went on, and because we're both not endemic StarCraft people, we're both like grumpy British guys coming from Counter-Strike, coming in StarCraft. Obviously, you can understand people are automatically standoffish. They're going to be like, hey, you're not for my game. Like, I'll always give this analogy. I get it. Like, it's like if someone talks trash about your country, right? You might talk trash about your country all day long, but the joke is when someone isn't from your country and they do it, the first thing you think is like, whoa, wait a minute, whoa, hey, shut up. Like, even if what they're saying is right, party's just like, but who are you to say that, you know? So I get it. I understand why people stand offish, but basically the problem was I was trying to make a lot of these points. Like, I was trying to make the point that essentially this approach won't be meritocratic. It will end up with things like for example, you'll end up with those weird qualification things where like someone doesn't actually have to be good. They just have to like, you know, make it to like 8th place each time. And then they auto qualify to like the groups did. And then eventually what you find with that is you get these weird loopholes where, like I say, you don't really have to necessarily be a top 15 player, but maybe you just keep staying in the season. Meanwhile, like I said about the qualifiers, maybe the qualifier to get into next season is an online thing. And then some dope ass player can't get in this time because, you know, I mean, I've always said the reason I hate online qualifiers is exactly because you play so many matches against sometimes random people of any skill level, and you often play them in a row. So my joke often is, right, you know how if you have a small plane, like one of those little ones that they fly you, like, you know, to Aspen from like some small airport or whatever, like a rickety one, right? Obviously, famously, if birds come into you, you die, right? Because it'll just blow the engine up, you'll die. My analogy always goes, like, obviously a bird itself isn't actually better than an engine, but if the wrong bird goes in there, you die, right? So my analogy for online qualifiers is, it's like you've got all these dope-ass amazing Korean players and top players, and all you're hoping is they land safely and the bird doesn't come in, because the bird is just the random people in the qualifier. And the amount of people in this analogy, the amount of planes that got crashed, guys, before they reached the airport to play was insane. So I was never that big a fan of that approach, unfortunately. And then also they put in that weird thing, which I never quite understood, which is they simultaneously did like a bit of that Korean Asian approach. Like, you remember, you couldn't be in the Americas one anymore unless you had an actual green card. So in a way, they sort of did like region lock it, sort of. Like, there was still some people could get around it, like Trap and Pult, etc. But then the downside of that was, this is where I actually have, again, a totally different philosophical perspective to most people. At the time, the argument went like this: by allowing NA players to sort of be isolated and protected and put in this bubble, it will mean it's not too harsh. So they'll be able to like develop at their own pace. And because they're in the tournament, they'll get like experience and they'll build up their skills. And then eventually the idea is, you know, when they get good, they'll go to BlizzCon where all these regions meet and they'll show that they're good. Well, the joke is, and I think history's proven me right on this one, how did those BlizzCons go, guys? Weren't those BlizzCons just like 14 to 15 Koreans? The Western guy, the one guy that makes it, just go straight out anyway. And then the joke is, until Serral, like, no one was ever doing anything at those tournaments, really. It was just the Koreans running rampage. Yeah. And if anything, you could argue after the initial early years where we used to all play the Koreans and all the Westerners, you could actually argue when they got isolated, it made it worse for the Westerners. It took a few more years before you could actually have any chance, really. They were just dominant ones. So I've always personally believed the opposite. I actually believe if you want to get better, you want to play all the best people. You actually, even though it's going to be harsh for your career, you're not going to be as successful. You're not going to kind of get like softer money. If you ever have a chance to be good, be even the brutal playing your first tournaments with Korea, that's going to give you the chance, in my opinion. Like, if you ever are good, like the Stefanos, well, you'll rise through that. You'll actually find a way to beat this guy or get an upset or prove you've got work. I actually think it's the other way around. I think if you protect people and keep them in a bubble, actually they won't know what the top level is, or they might just develop in fucked up ways where, like, classically, I know in games like League of Legends where they region lock, you get metas that are totally busted. Like, you think you all know the strong stuff, then you go to the World Chat and like none of that works. It turns out you're all just wasting your time twiddling your thumbs for like 6 months. Meanwhile, if you'd have been playing the same tournament as that Korean team, you'd have known in match one that doesn't work or what the current strong thing is. So personally, essentially, that was my main issue with the WCS thing. It's like, one, I don't think it was as interesting, because essentially what you were saying was, there's not enough NA players that I care about. So it's like, what's your solution? Just make an NA only league with all those players no one knows. It's like, well, then no one's going to watch it and no one's going to care. And quite frankly, as I say, how many of those players really did become good? Because if anyone says, well, what about like Scarlet and Neba? Like, they were already good. Yeah. And the joke is, I would argue, how did they get good? They were good by going to Korea, you idiots. Yeah. The joke is those literal players went to Korea and went in the team house, and then suddenly they became dope. Like, if anything, you're making a point in my case, guys, not for WCS. So even though it's quite controversial, I wasn't in favour of it. I actually get the sense, though, the reason why so many people were is because, first of all, I think they just bought that line that, you know, if you make like a safe space, people will be developing it, which I just don't agree with in life. I mean, it goes back to what I said at the beginning. It's not the world I grew up in, mate. The world wasn't a nice, safe place. It's more like, how do you navigate the dangers and how do you make yourself a threat to some degree if you have to be in order to get yours in the world? I have a different perspective. My perspective is sort of, you take what's yours. You don't wait for them to give you it and hand it out, you know, because that doesn't happen in real life. So I would just say, I always favoured everything that was like meritocratic. I just want the best players to play. What people don't realize is this. They used to think that just means I'm like a Korean fan or something. No. My position for real is whoever's the best should play. So if that means like the BlizzCon, bizarrely, in some alternate timeline, is like 15 Mexican players and 1 Korean, then cool, I'm in for that too. Fucking, Fire con Dios or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and you're right. Like that is one point I don't think I ever really thought about was there was a lag there, right? Like we got the region lock there in like 2013, and then we didn't end up seeing Neeb really step up on the international stage until like 2016, 2017.
It was a few years, right?
Yeah. There was like 2-3 years there where there was not a lot of like foreign hopes anymore. We didn't have the Stefanos and Thorzanes and stuff like that anymore. The region locking led to some very weird circumstances, and so like you saw these couple Koreans that had the economic engine behind them to get them the visas and all that stuff, but then you also saw like really hilarious things where like Stefano was past his prime and retired, but he would qualify for tournaments through the Africa qualifier because he's Tunisian, and like and things like that were very silly, but that's just a little point. Speaking of Korea and shifting gears away from StarCraft a little bit, I've heard a lot of these complaints more recently from like the LCK teams that they're alleging against Riot in reference to like financial unviability, lack of revenue sharing. What do you think about that? Do you think this is like an endemic issue from publishers not revenue sharing with esports teams, or what is the dichotomy there?
It's a bit of both, actually, because it's a bit of, like you say, about digital rev sharing, which is terrible at the moment. And then the other part, actually, is a bit like what I was talking about with things like franchise leagues and things like that. So essentially, it's that the developer also wants to control it, like Blizzard did with WCS and like Riot has with LCK and all these regions, etc. So the main problem, I would say, goes like this, right? People from StarCraft will actually be able to understand this analogy without even knowing League of Legends. You know how in early StarCraft 2, another factor that was very unique, it doesn't exist now, was that when you watched GSL, you paid for it. If you didn't pay, you got a very low quality stream. You didn't get the VODs, if you remember. I mean, sadly, it's a bit cursed because the joke is the website doesn't even exist anymore. You can't even access the old VODs. But at the time, we all, like Netflix, had a subscription so we could watch the games and then watch the VODs. And it was just a normal thing. It wasn't even some big, like, oh my God, I'm paying for it. At the time, it felt like, well, of course I'm paying for it. I want better quality and I want to watch all the VODs. Like, it's actually a service where I want the thing I am paying for. I'm not doing it just because, like, I guess I better support people. Like, it really was where you appeal to people's selfish nature. You give them something they want. You offer a certain price. It was quite well priced. I think it was like $6 or so. It wasn't very much. It was like quite reasonable. So we all subscribed, right? If people don't know, that was the same case in League of Legends. But are you ready for the classic move? Notice how the cycle repeats. The game developer killed it. They killed the golden goose again, so they could have one cooked goose meal and then no more golden eggs anymore. Because what happened was, when they used to do tournaments like GSL, the ones in League of Legends were by On GameNet, the people who did the OSL, they were called On GameNet Champions, OGN Champions. It was sort of like a season of GSL. It's the same setup, by the way. They were even they knew the fans know Korean esports and StarCraft, so let's do the same setup, right? It wasn't a league like LCK is now. What happened was, in this era, my friend Monte Cristo, who I do my talk show with in League of Legends, he was the main commentator for the English broadcast. And so back then, the same scenario, if you wanted the highest quality Twitch stream and you wanted access to all the VODs, you had to subscribe to their OGN Twitch channel, like the English language stream or whatever. And I can tell you, Monty has said this publicly and privately, they were making millions of dollars off this English language, millions, mate, from subscribers every month. Like, and it had a whole thing where when people would watch, they even had a whole thing where they called it the OGN Legion, and people would kind of like have a hashtag they would all put. And they had this like crazy, again, like actually like grassroots, financially like subscription model approach to esports, and it was mega. But as you can imagine, Riot came along and were like, now everyone must have free access to the game so the viewing numbers can be as high as possible. But in doing so, if you were the tournament organizer, it just killed it completely for you. Now look, part of the other reason Riot did that is their plan later was, hey, guess what, On GameNet, you don't even get to do League of Legends, we're going to take over that with Riot Korea, and we're going to do our own broadcast. So they also exerted control in that regard. But essentially what I'm getting to here is, like, if people don't know, there really was an actual like revenue model back then, which is what you would want now. That's exactly, by the way, I can tell you what real sports companies and businessmen who come into esports now, the first thing they say is, yeah, but where does the fan pay? Like, he doesn't actually contribute anything. He just watches, and I just sell through. Like, that's the if people don't know, sports teams make a small amount of their income from the sponsorship. That's just some stuff you do on the side. Like, it's all about the ticket sales or people subscribing to like NFL Pass or some sort of Premier League things you can watch on TV. Essentially, we had that in esports, both in StarCraft and in League. And sadly, they killed the golden goose. They got rid of both of them and they went to this free model, which everyone does now, which is, by the way, the reason that one's terrible is because all you're doing, like old school internet, is I'm just going to sell you as many eyeballs as possible. You're going to try and pay me as little as possible for them. And then along the way, I try and make a bit of money, but that can never add up to the amount that we're putting in the rest of the industry. So sadly, I actually do think that there was like a really key thing there that was going to work in that regard. What was the rest of the question, by the way? What was the question at the beginning?
It was more specifically about the complaints that LCK is alleging about financial unviability and lack of revenue sharing.
So first of all, to me, there's an obvious angle. You've already spoiled that particular ecosystem. You could have had this input, even from foreign viewers, that would have been worth millions, which means that they could change it. Like the joke there is, obviously, then the tournament organizer could put some more of that into prize money if you want, or pay the team's appearance fee, whatever. That's a way to offset costs, right? So when these teams complain now, it's pretty significant if people don't know, because teams like Gen G and T1 are spending like $10 million a year, like in salaries on their players, and they're doing like huge buyouts. So when they tell you they're not making money and they're in trouble, that's not like some loser in business who's whack and it's like, I just can't cut it. It's like, that's the most successful organizations telling it. So what they're telling you basically is the whole model's broken. It doesn't work. And then the angle you've nailed is, because everyone feels like you can't go back in time and start up the subscription model again. And the problem now you've got is you've given everyone it for free for all these years. So now you're not doing what I said before of like, I'd like to pay for something better. Now it's sort of like you feel like someone took the thing you had for free and they're like, well, if you pay me, I'll give you it back. That's exactly what's going to make people not pay and even go for like bootleg options like they do with the UFC. They're going to feel like, oh, you're ripping me off. What the hell? I shouldn't pay for that, which is not the mentality we want to cultivate in fans. Because I always say, I'm a fan myself, and when I watch at the NFL, I pay for the pass, mate. I want to have the best quality and watch the VOD and go through. I'd gladly pay for it. It's a fabulous service. It's really well done, actually. I want that to be the case in esports. And so the issue is, since we haven't gone that route, we've gone this, it has to be free and have as many viewers as possible. The one route left, as you say, is obviously the game dev themselves to acknowledge that we are bringing a load of attention to their game. And I would say this is the key thing. The other thing that the Koreans, when they fought that battle of IP rights, it's not just like the performer is what makes you watch. Yeah, they're also the reason you stay involved in the game. I think that's a key part people miss. Dude, none of us would ever be playing StarCraft Brood War like competitively 20 years later. You might play for fun on the ladder, but like the reason you keep playing and keep interested is because of people like Flash and J-Dong and massive tournaments on StarCraft when people doing brand new fucking build or win Blizz. The joke is, how many times have you ever watched a big final and thought, fuck it, I'll boot up the game? Yeah. And then obviously 5 minutes in, you're like, oh shit, I'm actually garbage compared to them. But, it got you hyped, didn't it? It made you think that the game had this extra value again. Whereas again, if that was just a game in your Steam, like we all have a million of them, you'd never bloody open it again. It'd be played 3 years ago, never again. So I actually think on that aspect, that's why in the future, if there's going to be actual real money, it's got to come from the digital items. If they're not going to go the subscription route and get it from fans, you've got to get it from the game dev. Because the one thing you cannot argue against is the biggest game devs, Riot Games, Blizzard, they are making so much fucking Valve in Counter-Strike. They are making a lot of money from the game. Yeah. And they're going to, the problem is though, this is why at the moment they're having, like you say, these public pushbacks of like the idea like, hey, we're like basically, what the teams in LCK are sort of telling Riot there is like, hey, we're your partner and we provide the performers in the game. So we need a better cut to make it work. Yeah. The problem you have essentially is, I think again, that the game developer, whether it's a Blizzard or a Valve or a Riot, they're obviously trying to pay as little of that money over as possible. So they're trying to argue, no, it's just the game. And, I provide, they're buying that skin or model for the game, not because of your team, And so unfortunately, you have this battle at the moment going back and forth. But to me, it's just obvious that if you want to have these teams operate on this kind of level, because we're talking millions of dollars, you're going to have like a really sturdy system where they can sell skins and in-game items and things that fans buy and, unique things that change from season to season. In the same way as if I am a fan of Manchester United, I'm not, it's a joke, I picked the worst team ever for that one. You buy the new kit every season, don't you, if you actually are the fan? It doesn't even matter if it's only slightly changed. You buy it because you want to show that you're a fan, you've got the newest kit. Like, again, these are the kinds of things from sports that we want to bring into esports. I think the area people miss is this. They think the way you get a fan to pay like they do in sports is you make esports like sports. No, what you've got to look at is What do they do in sports that captures the desire of the fan and makes him want to pay? That's the way you look at it. So to me, you could go either way. You could go back to get to pay. I would gladly pay for a pass, but obviously that's not the current sponsorship model. That's viewed as a short circuit that. Or if you're going to do the open model, you've got to have the game dev pay more, whether that's through in-game items purchased. I'd even be up for, I know they've done it a few times, but I don't think they've done it enough. I'd be up for like custom esports things. Like I've always thought, why not use the in-game item almost to crowdfund a tournament or something? And when it reaches a certain, make it almost like a stretch goal. When it reaches this point, the prize purse goes to that. And then when it reaches this next unlock, maybe we add North American players get to come or something. I've always thought you've got to go on an approach like that, because the other problem you notice you get into here is, this is why there will be a lot of legal battles fought like this for years in court, mate, is who can determine how much the esport brings to the game? Like how much do they make in League of Legends from a faker playing, or how much is just because people play the game? Like no one actually knows the answer to these questions. And quite frankly, until we've done like Discovery and we get the numbers from the game devs, you'll notice they never give those numbers out. Until we get those numbers, we're never going to really know. Because I suspect, and my friend Monty Crystal would be better to talk about this because it's one of his main sort of like bugbears. I suspect actually some of them are like, right, I'm making a lot of money. And then they're making a lot and they're just pretending like, oh yeah, I'm giving you your cut. But that's like a drop in the bucket. The joke is like, even if they give something for the skins for Worlds to Faker, I'm sure he has made so many millions more for Riot than he will ever get back from them in prize money or cut of digital items.
Oh yeah, it's like something like over $1 billion a year in revenue just for League of Legends from the numbers that I saw. But anyhow, yeah, like I remember talking to Torch. I don't know if this is a really old school name. Yeah, he was telling me about this from the GSL perspective, where in the early days, same thing. I don't think it was millions of dollars, but he was saying that
a lot though.
Yeah, he said that it represented a pretty significant portion of the income that GOM was bringing in was through those subscription fees, and that really helped them move towards viability. And then they ended up, of course, eliminating that as well. And yeah, absolutely, it makes sense. Like if there's no direct monetization from the audience, and that's the fundamental problem. Like this is the point that I brought up to many people in the StarCraft community over the last few years, is that look how successful the GSL crowdfunding was. I don't know if you saw a lot of this, but like the GSL was in its death throes. Like Blizzard cut the funding. Africa couldn't provide a really significant prize pool, and so there was an 80% prize pool reduction going into 2023. The community came together and was able to curb that to maybe something like 50% reduction, but still a really significant reduction. But it goes to show, like, foreign viewers want to put money into the thing that they care about, like, and now it's like more of an altruistic thing. But like you said, the original sort of model was, no, this is not an altruistic, this is a product, and people are very happy to purchase a product for something that they care about. So yeah, it's a very weird shift in the community, or in monetization sort of model.
Now, you could even argue, mate, it affects people like me and you. Like the joke is, there's another thing. The obvious thing as well to me is like getting the game and the VOD that you'd get in this pass is, if it was the modern day, like my analogy about the NFL, I'll tell you a cool thing if you have the NFL pass, if you're not from America, they put like the halftime game show in there when it's like the Super Bowl. And she's look at all the analysis. Like to me, people like you and me would have been creating stuff for like a pass. You'd have like a season pass. And then the idea is you'd have interviews and documentary features and hype trailers and things reviewing the matches and interviews with the devs on what the new changes are. This would have obviously eventually developed, like all these things do, to be part of the pass, and to be part of like a battle pass type scenario. So I also think there's a world where like the media side of the industry probably would have withered on the vine like it has, because this, our model's broken. Our model also is get as many eyeballs onto a YouTube video as possible, but everyone knows people pay cents for YouTube, thousands of YouTube views, so it just doesn't check out. You can't do it just from ad rev on YouTube alone. You can't do it. The joke is, like when I make my living, I have to do it like a team. I have to get a sponsor that then bankrolls the whole thing, and then the joke is the YouTube stuff's just some like pocket money on the side to pay for the domain or something,
Yeah, just about. Switching over to more of like the CS2 angle. So we talk about financial inviability of some of these esports organizations and tournament structures, but then, like, for example, I look at this IEM Katowice tournament that I just attended. Viewership numbers are really good. It looks like they were approaching almost 1 million concurrents, for the peak matches. Is that a viable number, like based off of your industry knowledge? Like if you're pulling 1 million viewers, is it viable to have an organization and a structure around something like Katowice, or do you think that that's something that still might be operating in the negative?
As far as I know, and this might actually shock people, like I haven't in the last, like, say, year or so talked to anyone behind the scenes about this, but before that, I obviously used to work a lot of the events myself and actually know the tournament organizers. And they told me back at the day that you lost millions doing those massive tournaments. Like you could actually lose $1 million running a giant, like, tournament in a big stadium that looks like a sporting event. But the problem, like I'd said before, is for the sporting event, one, someone pays a high ticket price for that. And then two, it lasts 3 hours. The esports event lasts all day long in the same stadium with all the same costs, but scaling up. And then the joke is you get like a tenth as much for the ticket price because it's not a Taylor Swift concert. You aren't paying $400. You're paying, like, I don't know, $20 to go for a whole day. So the problem is basically a lot of the economics aspects don't actually make sense. Like I was told some of those events basically are almost like a loss leader, if you know that concept from like a supermarket where you make like Coca-Cola's like $1 for the bottle because you want someone to go for the Coke and then they buy all the other items in their shop, don't they? So you're willing to lose the money on the Coke because that scenario gets them in the shop, right? It's like that. Essentially, I was told part of doing the stadium event really is just to have all those cool shots and be able to show people, hey, look, I'm in the stadium. It's like sports because that's to sell to the sponsor, you know. It's not actually that big a moneymaker. Now, look, there are some people will argue about this. Like, for example, when I did the major in Stockholm in 2021 for PGL, right? They are a Romanian company, and I can tell you from behind the scenes, they do things very differently over there where they just make it work as a business, mate. As in, there'll be one guy who just does 3 people's job. As in, if that was like MLG in America, you'd even legally have to have 3 people do those jobs. No, it's just one guy, and he really does like have eyes like piss holes in the snow, as we say in England, and he just looks like he lives off, you know, caffeine molecule, essentially. Like, and that guy, by the way, it's like the month doing like TI in the major for him is like Vietnam or something. You know, he's seen some shit after that. And you can imagine how stressed these people are. But I'll tell you what, if you want to make the margins work, that's what you do. You just crush the margin and you make one person work for however much, for however long to get it to work. So I've heard there are some people, they claim that they could actually make money doing their majors. But I think a lot of it's probably things like that and things that, quite frankly, I mean, I've often told a joke that I actually knew years before everyone that China would take over the world economy, because I went there in 2009 for a Counter-Strike event and I saw a guy, just like a maintenance worker, fixing a light bulb on a what do you call it, a street lamp, right? And the reason why my joke is I knew that America and the West could never compete is because this guy was on the top of a ladder and the ladder was based on the shoulders of another man who was below him and he was fixing the light. Now, you'll know this in America, like, mate, the health and safety would shut you down. You probably need like a union person that you pay to stand and watch them do. And the joke is, if I have to do all that, but then he just puts the ladder on his shoulder and fixes the light bulb in 5 seconds, how do we compete with that? So I would say the same thing. I get the vibe that in certain areas, it's why actually I think if you look, they are actually doing a lot of esports in China, or until the Russia-Ukraine war, they were doing a lot of Counter-Strike took place in Eastern Europe. I've got to tell you, mate, because again, there were loopholes there. You could save costs and crush the margins. I do get the vibe, and you've seen this from the Overwatch League actually in America, that in the West, it's really hard to do big esports events in America, for example, now. Like, those stadiums cost a lot of money. The security costs a lot. You have curfews. Sometimes you can't go past 10 p.m. and you've got like an overtime game at 8:59. It's still going. So there's all sorts of crazy things over there. Fire hazard things stop you doing certain. There's all sorts of extra factors that make it very, very difficult. And so famously, that's why people often say that it's possible that all the online period where we had a couple of years ago might have even saved the Overwatch League, because if they'd have actually made those owners run all those homestands, the joke is they'd have just bankrupted themselves because they'd just be paying so many $100,000 for each of them, basically for optics, to make it look cool. That like they would have only lasted a year or two, and they might have already had to come to Blizzard and say, basically, we have to leave. We can't pay the franchise fee anymore. It's too expensive. So as far as I can tell, a lot of that is more, it's still just a lot of optics. It's not really like a money maker in that same way. Otherwise, I mean, I think it's quite logical. They'd just be, if those events made money, you'd do as many as you could, wouldn't you? You'd make it like a sport. You'd have like one every week. So to me, I get the vibe that that's why even the biggest companies like an ESL, they do small, medium events that are way bigger, smaller scale. And then they do like the one big one every few months like this to sort of show off and show like, this is what we're capable of. But as far as I know, you lose money doing those events.
Yeah, it seems difficult to monetize something at that scale when you see the number of people that are working the events, and you know what it costs to, rent the equipment and build the stages and the prep time, and it's like a weeks long thing. It's kind of wild. So yeah, I see 1 million viewers. I'm like, that's quite a lot. But then I see like the behind the scenes of the production, and I start to understand how it's not as simple as it looks.
One other thing as well, the problem in esports, and this is a line that everyone in business needs needs to understand is every viewer isn't of equal value monetarily. So the other problem you do have is when it says 1 million, well, I can tell you specifically in Counter-Strike, we have a lot of viewers that are on like the Brazilian core stream, or famously, obviously, Eastern Europe used to have a massive contingent of people who watch the Russian and Ukrainian teams. And the problem there is, I mean, anyone who does YouTube knows this. If you can go on YouTube and just look at a breakdown, and essentially you make nearly all your money in ads from the American viewer, the British viewer, then maybe like an Australian, essentially people who speak English primarily. Unfortunately, if you have like hundreds of thousands of views on the YouTube video, but they're all from India or something, I'm sorry, the sponsor doesn't want to sell to them, or you maybe can't even, so it's not worth as much. So that's the other reason why sometimes the big absolute number might look cool to me and you, but it might not really be worth it in the same way as like, yeah, if that was like a American TV show with 1 million viewers, probably hundreds of millions bringing in, yeah, of course.
Yeah. I see that a lot with some of these very large Indian YouTubers, where like they have ginormous numbers, but the revenue numbers,
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this one, be sure to leave a like and a comment down below. Get subscribed so you don't miss out on future releases like this one. If you really enjoy what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon. The link is in the video description. That's all for now, my friends. Until next time.